Okay, this is going to be a lengthy but necessary teaching module under the category Incentives Matter, specifically tax and subsidy incentives, government revenues, and expenditures. It's kind of like a civics lesson. So the first thing we want to look at is the general idea is you should tax the things you're trying to discourage and subsidize the things you're trying to encourage. And so the first observation I'd like to make is in our consciousness today, in our public discussion, we have this idea that you should tax the rich, when in fact we should be encouraging wealth creation. And then we also have the idea that we should subsidize the poor, when in fact that just perpetuates poverty. The poverty trap of if you remain poor enough, then you are entitled to things. So that we have the entire incentive structure under the welfare state misapplied. Tax the rich and subsidize the poor. Okay, so what we're going to look at is, again, government revenues and expenditures. So we're looking at the federal, state in the United States, the nation state level, then the states, 50 states in the United States, and then the local or city level, revenues and expenditures. So we'll start with the, so expenditures are supposed to be for public goods. In other words, if the market can't provide for something, then there's a role for the state to provide that. When I say the state, that's the entity that has the legal monopoly on power. In other words, do what the state says, no matter which level. Pay your taxes or go to jail, or follow our regulations or pay a fine or go to jail. So when I say the state, I mean the entity that has the legal monopoly on coercion. So, so expenditure should be used for, state expenditures should be used for public goods, things which can't be provided for by the market through mutual exchange. So you need state coercion to provide these things. And what the definition of public goods has constantly expanded. And so we've done a hard-fire TV show on that you can see, where we discuss public goods in theory and practice. So at the federal level, the source, so taxes are the source of revenues for the state. They don't make profits. They, through exchange, they gain revenues through taxation. So through coercion. So the largest source of revenue for the federal government is the income tax. Then you have excise tax, which is a form of a sales tax on gasoline and alcohol. And just, I'm not an expert on excise tax, but I'm sure there's lots of federal excise tax. And then trade tariffs, which is simply a tax on importing goods. And that, of course, under our current administration, was a big source of his political populism, is putting tax on aluminum and steel so that he get the support of those unions and industry leaders. Then the wealth tax. A lot of politicians, some politicians today, are saying there should be a tax on wealth. Wealthy people, decided by whom, how, with what kind of knowledge, for what reason, that the wealth should, people who have income or wealth above a certain amount should pay a tax on that. Again, tax the rich. So it remains to see if that will be constitutional or not. There was a constitutional amendment in 1914 to allow the income tax to occur. And then if you remember, the shared responsibility fee for the Affordable Care Act went to the Supreme Court. who declared it was a tax, so therefore legal. And we should note so this is in 1800, the largest source of revenues for the US government was trade tariffs. Then you had the classical liberal period of history and free trade, trade tariffs went down as a percentage of federal income until the 1930s, and then more recently. So in 1800, the largest source of revenues for the federal government was trade tariffs, and the size of the state in the economy was only 5%. In 1900, alcohol excise tax was the largest source of revenue for the federal government, and again, the state was only 5%. Then in 1914, you get the income tax and the creation of the central bank and the end of the gold standard, and now the largest source of revenue for the federal state is the income tax, and the state is up to 40%. So what does the federal government do with these revenues for alleged public goods? Well, most people agree that the role of the nation state is to provide national defense, not national offense, but defense. And then the original idea of the founders, the Declaration of Independence, was federalism, or a republic where the states had rights. And but that all again ended with the Constitution and the General Welfare Clause. So what a lot of the federal revenues are fiscal transfers to the states in the form of corporate and social welfare. So by the federal government transferring monies to the state level, then they control policy. So the states' rights have been subsumed by the fiscal transfers. So specifically what the corporate welfare transfers and corporate welfare federal spending is for transportation infrastructure. Yes, the highway systems, bridges, things like that, tunnels. And all categories, federal, state, and local, are public employee labor unions, bureaucrats. So that many employees, for example, the current mayor of New York City has doubled the number of government bureaucrats, all of whom are public employee, most of whom are public employee labor union members, who then vote for those who give them their patronage. And then on fiscal transfers on the social welfare side, and corporate welfare and social welfare are 85% of the economy. I've done a TV show on that. You can replace the 85% of the economy of federal government revenues and expenditures, replace corporate welfare and social welfare with a basic income, and you get rid of the politically motivated transfers, and everybody age 18 and over can get $1,000 a month, and then you depoliticize the society. But so social welfare, of course, are Medicare, Medicaid, and health insurance, and so there's transfers from the federal level to the state level. Next, we'll look at the state level revenues and expenditures. So the states also have income tax, most states, some don't, Texas, Delaware, Florida. State income tax, and then also excise tax, or a form of sales tax. And the state, a lot of the expenditures at the state level are for corporate cronyism, which means under the mentality under Keynesian economics that the state is a paternalistic job creator. The state should provide jobs, work. Instead of self-determination entrepreneurship, the state has become a paternalistic job provider. And that a lot of that form is taken in the form of corporate cronyism, where, for example, recently the Amazon headquartered debacle about which state would pay Amazon the most to locate there, or which city. City also does corporate cronyism, also known as corporate welfare. Both the states and cities have offices of economic development, which are not under the classical liberal period of economic development meant capital accumulation and economic growth. Today, economic development means job creation through corporate cronyism, where certain corporations are given tax breaks and subsidies to locate in certain places. And what that does, that type of mentality creates a beggar thy neighbor situation where, let's say, New York offers Amazon $2 billion in subsidies, meaning we'll give you cash to help you renovate the neighborhood, or tax breaks. You don't have to, you and your employees, or you don't have to pay income tax or sales tax or whatever tax for however long a period if you locate in our jurisdiction. So what that does is that creates a race to the bottom, or a beggar thy neighbor. Let's say Amazon calls up the economic director of New York State and says, how much are you going to offer me? And they say $2 billion. Well, then Amazon says, or whichever corporation, could be, there's many, you know, most corporations move because they get the tax breaks and the subsidies. Well, Florida's offering $2.1 billion. So, oh, okay, then we'll give you 2.2 billion. So you get this race to the bottom. And so everybody pays for the special treatment that certain corporations and their employees get, and their shareholders get certain privileges under this beggar thy neighbor corporate cronyism. An example I'd like to give is Barclays Center in downtown Brooklyn. Eventually, it was the Atlantic Yards. It was an unused transportation system that was eventually given to the Ratner Development Corporation with 1.5 billion in subsidies and tax breaks. And the Ratner Corporation also happens to own the shopping malls across the street from Barclays Center. So 1.5 billion in tax breaks and subsidies to create Barclays Center. And there was the NIMBYs, not in my backyard. The wealthy people in downtown Brooklyn didn't want Barclays there because it would also include skyscrapers, which would then prevent sun from coming down on their own homes. So you had local people in the downtown Brooklyn who didn't want Barclays to occur, but the labor unions wanted it to occur, especially the iron and steel workers unions wanted it to occur because it was a big construction job, as are all of these sports stadiums and convention centers and other white elephants. So you had the labor unions paying people to walk around. Barclays Center will create jobs, will create jobs. And in the end, there was only 3 local people allowed in the iron and steel workers unions. So the 1.5 billion in tax breaks created 3 jobs at a grand total of 500 million per job created. And in my research on corporate cronyism, that's the record. Again, it depends how you measure it, why you measure it. But in general, it costs about $150,000 per job created under this corporate cronyism, which is a lot of taxes to pay back. Okay, so then at the local level, revenues come from the sales tax and property tax. And then again, the expenditures at the local level are supposed to be used for public goods. And at the local level, that would be parks, police, fire, and public education. Again, the teachers' unions are big in public education, and bolding, the image 1956 tells us in these huge depersonalized societies that the purpose of public schooling is to create a positive image of the state as the problem solver. Let's see. And also at the local level, you have corporate welfare and beggar thy neighbor, corporate cronyism. So an example I'd like to give, so when I first moved to New York about 15 years ago, the mayor's name was Bloomberg, and he was known as a very paternalistic figure. And one day I went to buy cigarettes, and the price had gone up $3.50. So Bloomberg overnight, his tax officials and his revenue office says, okay, you can tax things you want to discourage, cigarettes, and then you can raise a certain amount of revenues by doing so. But the unintended consequence and the problem with this partial equilibrium measurement of revenue flows and the effects is that now there's a huge underground smuggling. So I'm not going to tell you that I buy my cigarettes without paying New York City tax, but some people do. Okay, so what else? I guess that completes our teaching module on incentives matter, government revenues and expenditures, and tax and subsidy incentives.